My name is Glenn Iseger-Pilkington. I'm the curator here at Fremantle Arts Centre. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on Whadjuk Noongar Budja today and our galleries sit upon Noongar country. It's really important for us to tell stories of place and to acknowledge the ancient and enduring history of this country. Undertow was a really great opportunity to work with the festival and create an exhibition that really responded to the theme of Warradan or oceans. Oceans are a kind of complicated space for many people for many reasons, and creating an exhibition that starts with an entry point like that enables so many different kinds of stories to be told. Undertow as an idea and a concept for me really spoke about stories below the surface, or revealing stories through creative and artistic works. Undertow, I guess as a word, has a kind of deeper, darker meaning, but at its core really is this idea of something pulling back in the background, something that's not always seen but it's always felt. And I think the artists and the creative team working in Undertow are really committed to revealing stories that perhaps aren't visible in the everyday here in the Australian context. Undertow kind of starts with, that beginning point of thinking of Warradan or oceans, and I think really from a curatorial point of view, I was interested in the way Australians kind of associate to ocean spaces. And for many Australians, a visit to the ocean is like to sunbathe, to swim, for fish and chips and an ice cream. And for me, as someone who's grown up kind of in multiple cultures, a First Nations culture and a European migrant culture, the oceans are a lot more complicated and nuanced than a trip to the seaside. And so I really wanted through this exhibition to unpack some of the nuance around oceans as site of arrival, departure, oceans as site of conflict and the arrival of colonisation, oceans as a site of ancestral knowledge and continued and enduring culture. And for me, it's really important that visitors walk away with a kind of refreshed or updated sense of what oceans mean to people in Western Australia. So we were really lucky to have the opportunity to work with Amanda Bell. Amanda is a Barimaya and Yuid artist, so Nyunga and Yamaji practitioner whose career only recently began as a visual artist, and she's been in our revealed Aboriginal Emerging Arts Showcase a couple of times, and most recently had a major work which was done in glass neon with the word mudich. Mudich is a word in Nyunga language which means deadly or great or solid. It's a word that's really full of positivity and means so much to so many people. For people to walk into our site and to see Nyunga language illuminated in hot pink on the walls of our building just marks a really significant moment for us in terms of how we consider our site and the stories we tell around it and the people we welcome into our building. Amanda's most recent work, Balak in Undertow, which means naked in Nyunga, is a bit of a departure from the positive messages that were seen in her first works that she exhibited here and the works that sit in our courtyard. It really looks at Warradan or oceans as the point of arrival of great destruction and an attempt at full assimilation and annihilation of Aboriginal peoples that lived in the lands of Nyunga people and Yamaji people and all around our country. So that work really begins with this idea of silence and rage. And so as you enter the gallery, you see etched into the wall in a deep blood red the words, "Our silence is full of rage." And in working with Amanda in the months preceding the exhibition, she really grappled with this idea of how angry she could be in this exhibition as an artist and where was the line for her and how angry she wanted to be publicly. And I think for me, in that moment, I was always reminded of the kind of vulnerability of artists and how much of their own selfhood we see on display in these works. And Amanda's neon component in that exhibition is also paired with a grave in the corner of the galleries, which you see the bones of a kangaroo. This kangaroo was a kangaroo that she'd buried in the past and went and dug up for this exhibition. And I think she wanted to show a real care and reverence for this animal. and in the preparation of this work, painted each of those individual bones with a Maori gum and reconstructed as if it were the site where this animal had been buried. And the bones sit upon a bed of salt, which again sort of plays on this idea of oceans and that point of arrival. But also within this installation is the sound of the Southern Ocean, of rolling waves coming in and almost hitting you and creating a visceral experience for your body where you feel like perhaps you're only coming up for a moment of air in between these waves rolling in. And so the work in many ways kind of poetically riffs off this idea of ocean, but marks a kind of historic moment in time that would transform the lives of all First Nations people in Western Australia and more broadly the entire continent. We also had this incredible opportunity to work with artist and storyteller Ron Bradfield. Ron's really been a kind of storyteller, a poet, a facilitator, a kind of agent provocateur. He's incredible at getting people to feel comfortable in sharing and listening to truths. Ron is a bardman who, his culture heralds from the West Kimberley. He was born in Northampton in Nunda country, and his mother was a member of the Stolen Generation, so was taken from the West Kimberley early in her life. Ron's work really grapples with that disconnection from place and country and culture and looks to reassemble and to find his way through his bard identity while also looking at his other saltwater story, which was being a member of the Royal Australian Navy. His father was in the military, and Ron knew growing up in the Midwest in the 1960s and 70s that he only had a couple of options in life, and one of them was that he could join the military or the Navy and be considered an acceptable person within Australian society. And that's a really hard thing to kind of grapple with, that for Aboriginal people, first people of this continent, that the only way that they could feel safe or that they were able to be seen as being successful was to disappear into this national defence. And so Ron joined the Navy, and I think that was a really critical part of his life, that time in the Navy. And so his works are the confluence of these two saltwater stories, of being a bardman from the West Kimberley, but also being a member of the Navy and defending the waters around this island continent. And his works really kind of are so interesting and nuanced in the way that, pearl shell, which from the West Kimberley, an engraved pearl shell would be called ridgie, made by men for ceremony, a very culturally important object that was traded from the West Kimberley all the way down into Pintupi country in Central Australia, and really made a significant contribution to kind of, trade across this continent. And so for Ron, coming from the place where those traditions herald, and not growing up there, not having the lived experience or the cultural inheritance to be able to work with pearl shell in that traditional way, Ron really uses pearl shell with a real kind of reverence, and he approaches them in such a way that kind of respects that cultural lineage. So the pearl shells that you see in his exhibition aren't engraved. They don't look like a ridgie, like an engraved pearl shell from the region. Instead, he works with guan, which is the bard word for unmarked or untouched pearl shell. And he invited all of his people that he served with in the Navy to be a part of this work through coming and marking on the pearl shell. One of the commissions that Ron worked on for this exhibition was a kind of scale drawing of the HMAS Westralia. So you walk into a gallery and this is upon the wall and you see all of these pearl shells, and they demark the different spots that people would live and work on the ship. Ron spent time on this ship for years, and unfortunately, 6 months after he left the Navy, the ship caught fire and ended up sinking in Coburn Sound. And so within the gallery, you'll see one pearl shell on the ground. And for me, I think that pearl shell is a symbol of trauma. It's a symbol of tragedy, both to do with the experiences of being in the Navy, the experiences of being the child of someone who was in the Stolen Generation, and the ongoing trauma of having to kind of put the pieces of your cultural self back together. So Ron also has some existing work in the exhibition, and those works, which were originally mounted in the City of Joondalup Gallery, really speak to kind of the visual languages of the Navy. So you have the ship's number in large text upon the wall. You'll see in the exhibition too that design work that is traditionally on pearl shell is on the wall in large format painted, but still, this is a symbol that means a lot to Ron and his family, but it's not on the pearl shell. And that cultural fracturing has resulted in Ron not having the knowledge to be able to work with those two things together. And it's a real homage to his old people and not kind of stepping into space that he doesn't feel comfortable in. Really, really thrilled to be able to include the work of Samoan Australian artist Angela Tiatia within Undertow. I've been admiring Angela's work for many years, and this was the perfect opportunity to include her with her work Holding On from 2015, which really looks at the complexities of the climate emergency and sea level rise for people who belong to and come from the Pacific. Holding On is a document of an endurance performance that Angela undertook while visiting islands within the Pacific. The work has her in reverse cruciform sitting on a concrete block while the water laps against her body. And what I really love about this work is that it kind of explores the idea of the threat and the threatened. Like, what is the threat to oceans? Well, it's us, it's people. But I think the threat and the threatened are often made opposing and positioned as binary and against each other. And I think for people who come from these ocean spaces, who live in island communities, oceans are so critical to their understandings of themselves. And so this kind of separation of the body of water and the body of human is really kind of anti everything that Islander people know. And so this work, Holding On, seeks to kind of explore the intimacy of the body of water and the body of human, and stitches those two things that are often considered opposing, the threat and the threatened, back together in a really poetic and beautiful way. The work invites you in. It's so seductive and there's so much poetry in it, but there is also this kind of underlying sense of danger. There's an uncomfortableness. The positioning of Angela's body within the work in this reverse cruciform really talks to the faith that so many Pacific Islander people place in this God who came to the islands, only a couple hundred years ago with colonialism. And people often talk about kind of God would never take our island homes from us in the Pacific, when the reality of that is that the climate emergency is playing out every month, and the kind of ever-changing shorelines of islands and the damage to reefs is ongoing and doesn't let up. And so Angela's work kind of, while it is poetic and gentle and invites you in and you could sit with it and watch it and have all kinds of different experiences with it, it is really speaking to how critical the decisions we make now are to the future of island-dwelling communities. We were also really thrilled to have the opportunity to work on a newly commissioned body of work with Soul Alphabet. Soul Alphabet are a small kind of happening or organisation that really seeks to amplify the voices of people of colour, and particularly the African diaspora here in Perth. And these are communities that are often not visible within the cultural landscape, yet they offer so much in terms of their cultural output and the influence that they have on our communities and everything that makes us unique as communities of such cultural diversity. The photographic series, At the Ridges of Our Hands, by Shanice Mwethi and also by Chalupa Young, really explore braiding practices as a tradition that have travelled the whole globe with the movement of people from the African continent. These are the practices that are about resilience and beauty, and they're also practices of deep knowledge. They're the knowledge embodied within every single braid that comes through the hands of people has been passed down over generations and generations. So peering into these practices, which are often considered as being about beauty, we actually see that there's a sense of community and connection and belonging in these spaces. There are rituals, and people drink coffee and eat cake before they allow someone to completely transform their appearance. And I think that intimacy that we're seeing in those photographs is a really powerful statement for people who are often not seen within the landscape of these kinds of exhibitions. We've commissioned a whole lot of new texts, a call and response kind of writing project for Undertow, and Sasonke Umsamang wrote this beautiful text which starts with the idea of, I love us when we're ordinary, when it's not our tragedy on display in the walls of a museum. And I think that's such a beautiful moment to be let into that intimate space where we're seeing the practices that make people feel strong and resilient as they navigate the world. So at Fremantle Arts Centre, we're really interested in beginning to do some work that happens beyond our galleries and beyond our site, and Undertow gave us a really unique opportunity to work with Walyalup-based artist Sam Bloor on a major site-based work down on the Esplanade in Fremantle, and also on significant works that speak to that here in the exhibition as well. That sinking feeling was comprised of two parts. The first sits in the galleries here at Fremantle Arts Centre, and the second part of the work was for the period of the festival down at Fremantle Esplanade Park. The work at Fremantle Esplanade Park, which was only on for a few weeks, was a text-based work which was on the carriages of the Ferris wheel. And all of these propositions and provocations that Sam works with are drawn from media interviews, from policy documents, from government websites, which talk about our borders, the Australian national identity, and all these tropes and platitudes of nationhood which we hear as growing up and living and working in Australia. Words like lucky country, sunburnt nation, these kinds of things that form a sense of what it is to be Australian. Sam works with in a way that asks us to really think about that. What does it mean to be Australian? Who is allowed to belong here? Who is allowed into Australia and who's not? So that sinking feeling really challenges those borders and the way that we manage borders and who is allowed in and who's not, really from the point of view of those people who seek asylum here in Australia and often travel to Australia by boat. So Sam worked with a number of people who have that lived experience of seeking asylum in Australia to kind of understand what people's responses were to the kind of ebbs and flows of border politics here in Australia. And one of the things that Sam found through his research and through his conversations, that despite those challenges that people have in coming to Australia and starting a new life, people feel really, really privileged and feel an immense sense of gratitude to being given that opportunity to start afresh. And as a curator, I was really interested in this kind of the empathy that we show as a nation, but also the absolute indifference that we show as a nation to some people who don't fit the bill, and the kind of resulting malaise that we have as a nation because of that. We don't move forward, we don't move backwards. We're stuck in this suspended animation because our policies are so in opposition with each other. Sam has a work in the exhibition which has mirrors positioned on walls which oppose each other. One of them says lucky country, the other says illegal bodies. And you kind of stand and see the reflection of each of these mirrors depending on which way you're looking at. But I think there's this moment where you see yourself in this work and you're kind of captured in this portrait of, Australian ideology and politic, this kind of welcome, but not if you come by boat, and I think at a time when we've recently had famous tennis players deported from our country, where the pandemic is seeing our borders so ferociously defended, this work is really poignant and really salient. We also had the chance to work with Gary Sibasato on this exhibition. Gary's work is this incredible manifestation of the Milky Way. And for Gary, as a barred man who's grown up in Lombardina, whose whole life is about the ocean, there's this really beautiful thing about you can't understand the ocean without understanding the sky. This beautiful work really seeks to kind of look at the interconnectivity of knowledge between ocean space and sky space, and the way that navigating sea country, particularly at night, is you need to understand the sky and what you see above, and you need to know what those markers are and seasonal changes in the sky also. And for me, this is a beautiful work that speaks to that kind of ancestral knowledge of water and sky, but also speaks to First Nations approaches to understanding the world, which are about the interaction and the interplay between kind of water and country and land and air and sky. And I'm really interested as a curator of Aboriginal heritage, as a Noongar Yamaji person. I'm really interested in bringing those worldviews into the fore within exhibition making, and not seeing them as being opposing to anything, but just being critical to understanding this continent and its anthologies in a way that makes sense for First Nations people. We had this incredible opportunity to commission some new work by mother and daughter creative team, Alyssa Jane Carmichael and Sonia Carmichael. I've known this family for over a decade, and the work they do so quietly and poetically is so important. This is a group of women who live and work on Minjerribah, so North Stradbroke Island in Queensland. They're Quandamooka people, and in this room, which is kind of the beating heart of the Undertow exhibition, we see oceans considered as these incredible vessels of knowledge and belonging. And so the work behind me, these large format cyanotypes, this is the largest scale that the women have worked at. These epic works talk about the knowledge that the women have inherited, but also the work that they do in cultural revitalisation. They have spent so much time working in museums, looking at their weaving practices, and Sonia talks about them as having been sleeping for a while. I think that idea of practices being sleeping or resting for a while is such a beautiful way to think about the great disruption that has happened because of colonisation here in Australia and its ongoing legacy. But I think these practices are inherited, and in the same way that we inherit trauma and we inherit a sense of self and understanding, I think these practices of making are so connected to the body and muscle memory that they too kind of can be within us, even though we may not have used them within our life. Within the main gallery here at Fremantle Arts Centre, you're kind of encountering this deep ocean chasm, and within each of the 6 major cyanotype works, we see different places around Minjerribah, sites of significance, sites of healing, sites where the fish will run at particular times of the year. But within them, you'll also see that there are woven forms, which Sonia and Lisi talk about. They let them make their own mark within these cyanotypes, which are sun exposures. Essentially, these large cottons are laid out on the ground, objects placed within them, and the sun is used to leave an exposure on the work. And so the woven works, which have been relearned or reactivated through Sonia and Alyssa Jane's practices, then are used to leave their own legacy within these other works. So I like that idea of some work then leaving a mark in a new work, it's this kind of interconnectivity of story. This significant installation, which in language means water footprints, or the moments that we leave on water, which are often fleeting and ephemeral. I really wanted to ensure that there was an elemental quality to the installation that spoke to where these works came from. And so we've brought a whole lot of beach sand into the galleries. And for me, it's really important that within colonial buildings, like the building here at Fremantle Arts Centre, that we're able to kind of challenge that history, or to at least offer a counterpoint to that history through the way we make exhibitions. So you've got these jarrah boards below us, which are probably from felled trees from the southwest or from the Great Southern, which were more than likely cut down during early colonial times, and they sit below us. So the whole building really speaks to a challenging history for First Nations people. So the opportunity to insert qualities of the natural world back into these buildings is really important for me as a curator. So we had an opportunity to work with a filmmaker based in Meanjin, Brisbane, Josh Maguire, who was able to go and visit the artists and create a really beautiful film offering, which allows artists to speak to their own work. And as a curator, I'm not really that interested in always being the great knowledge holder, the person who has all of the answers to all of the questions. I'm really interested in mobilising the voices of artists and the communities they come from to tell their own stories. Because who better to speak to a story than the person who it makes most sense to and who can speak from experience about it. And so being able to create some films which, tell those stories and will live on beyond the exhibition is also a really important part of the work that we do. Undertow is a complicated show. It doesn't tell a singular story or take a particular point of view, but what it does talk about is how complicated our communities are here in Australia, how complicated our histories are, how complicated our realities are. And it seeks to use Warradan or oceans as a way to connect all of our human experiences. And for me, exhibitions can do a couple of things. They can really celebrate a culture or a group in real depth and, in a really comprehensive nature. And I think there's a real role for that. They can highlight the work of a single artist or a group of artists who have worked together, and there's a role for that. But I think exhibition making is often undervalued in its capacity to connect people, in its capacity to bring disparate stories together and to really showcase the parts of our humanity that make us all connected. And for me, that's been a really beautiful part of Undertow, is the way that we can use a single entry point like oceans to tell stories of so many people and to see so many communities come into this exhibition and to feel seen and visible.